Chapter 19. Another round! Hitch boomed as the barmaids came to clear away their empty mugs. Soon trays arrived with fresh mugs full of foaming ale spilling down over the sides. Gratefully they lifted the mugs to their lips and drank deeply, feeling the tension and fear wash away. Deciding that the best way to hide was to do so in plain sight, the group had headed into a tavern. What was another group of thirsty travellers drinking away their worries? Taking over a large corner booth, Hitch had gone to the bar and slapped down enough steel coins to quickly see their table bursting with plates of roasted meat, sharp cheese, and slices of bread. They ate with ravenous abandon after so many simple meals on the grassy plains, washing it all down with gulps of bitter ale. Even Cielo had been permitted to have a couple of mugs of ale, and was soon feeling very light-headed and leaden-bellied. Looking around the table, Hitch couldn't help but notice his men, as he had come to think of them, kept looking around nervously, the haunted looks in their eyes, which had already seen more than any human in a half-dozen generations had. They did their best to smile back when their eyes met his, lifting their mugs in salute. He would give them a smile, with a wink or a nod of his head in encouragement. The tavern was busy, the other patrons making enough noise to put a battlefield to shame. Cielo was snuggled in against him with the heavy meal and ale, causing her to drift off. "You came back for me," he whispered to himself. "Back through that terrible darkness." Tears welled in his eyes, and he did not care who saw them. The image flashed in his mind of those horrific creatures in their black robes, swarming at her like rabid rats, lifted to safety with mere seconds to spare. If something had happened to you, there would have been no containing my rage. I would have split the very mountains, scorched the lands, and travelled to the abyss itself to claim the head of the Dark Queen. He started to shake now, the racking sobs overtaking him. Looking up, he saw the solemn looks and red-rimmed eyes of the others, who had been reliving their own inner traumas. "We need to go and find our families," one of the men said, looking very solemnly at Hitch. "I agree with you, lad. We've pushed this as far as I care to risk it, and it's time we cut our losses and beat feet out of here." There was a visible release of tension as the group was unsure how Hitch was going to react. The thought of their families, the uncertainty of what they would be going through after everything the group had faced, haunted them in their quieter moments. Cielo began to rouse now, yawning as she stretched her arms up above her head. "Back to the land of the living, eh?" Hitch asked playfully as he squeezed her closer for a moment. She looked around the table with bleary eyes before blinking and rubbing them clear. Rising on unsteady legs, she offered her excuses as she headed off to find somewhere to relieve herself. Turf and Hitch shared a look before Turf eased himself out of the booth and followed along after her. Cities could be rough places, and it seemed the more civilized the place was, the more ruthless the cutthroat element it attracted. Squeezing through the crowd, he struggled to keep sight of her before suddenly bumping into her back. A large man stood blocking their path. "Well, hello there, my lovely," he slurred as he looked her up and down, his red face beaded with sweat, showing he was probably 24 tankards into a heavy drinking session. Reaching up a hand, he tried to stroke the side of her face. Cielo slapped the hand away with a quick, hard stroke, faster than his eyes could follow. "Ooh, we got a fiery one here, lads. Is this cute little boy meant to be your boyfriend?" He looked past Cielo to see Turf standing there, shooting daggers, his body tensing. "We should slap a dress on him and have him serve the ale along with the other wenches." The loudmouth's friends started laughing like braying scavenger animals waiting to strike. He'd earn his weight in tips and a marriage proposal or two before the end of the night, one of the others piped up, following the lead of the hulking brute who he now looked to for approval. The sound caught Hitch's attention. The crowd had formed into a circle, hanging back to see what was about to happen. Swearing a powerful oath, he stood up on his seat before vaulting onto the table. Plates broke and beer mugs flew as he rushed to cover the distance before his comrades realized what he was doing. How he now longed for his axe that had been left stashed back under the pier. He could fell this group like young pines with a few quick strokes of that keen edge. Sprinting across the wood plank floor, sucking in huge gulps of air, he sounded like a gnomish steam engine under full power. Leaping, he tucked in his chin before turning himself into a flying battering ram. Oof! The man's breath burst out of his lungs as he pitched forward onto the floor. Too drunk to react in time, the world rushed up at his face, seconds before it crunched into the beer-stained boards. Light burst in front of their eyes as their nose was pulped into a bloody ruin. They caught a glimpse of a dwarf's eyes filled with rage, their teeth flashing in a feral grin, before Hitch turned, throwing his body into a powerful hook that struck a second man in the knee, causing him to collapse to the floor, screaming in agony. Swish! Taking advantage of the confusion, Cielo's hand whipped up in a blinding flash, the knife cutting a channel across the lead brute's face. He clamped his hands over the wound, stumbling back a few steps, before Cielo's foot came rocketing upwards in a vicious kick that caught him flush on the crotch. Crumbling to the ground, his bellows muffled by the blood gushing from the gash in his face. Turf pulled out his knives too, and the pair stood back to back, thrusting and jabbing to keep their attackers aback. They circled like wolves, ducking forward and pulling back, trying to find a weak point to break through their defenses. Hearts thumping, adrenaline racing, through their veins, they slashed back and forth, their whistling blades warding off the grasping hands. Their knives drew blood, slashing across fingers and knuckles that quickly withdrew with howls of pain and hateful curses. "Grab him! Hold him!" someone bellowed as Hitch was grabbed from behind and lifted into the air, writhing in place as the human did their best to pin his arms back. "Bastard horse sons!" Hitch roared, turning purple as he struggled to free himself. A man stepped forward, winding back his arm to deliver the thunderous blow that would cave in the dwarf's ribs. Hitch saw the look of cruel triumph on their face as they relished the moment, their fists arcing towards him in slow motion. Crash! Pieces of wood exploded out in all directions as the bar stool broke across the would-be attacker's back. John Henry Tanner stood there, with their eyes still squeezed shut for a moment, holding the back of the chair above the crumpled body down on the ground. Hitch stopped struggling to look on in amazement for a moment before he found himself falling to the floor. A second later, a boot came crashing into his back, sending him tumbling across the floor. He arched his back, his hand coming around reflexively to try and touch where the boot had struck. White-hot pain shot through him, and for a moment he could not even bring himself to breathe. "Dad, no!" Cielo screamed as she raced off through the crowd, wildly slashing with her knife to clear a path before throwing herself on top of Hitch, eyes flicking in every direction for danger. Turf realized half a second too late that Cielo was no longer covering his back, turning just in time to see the fist that came smashing into his face. For a moment he seemed to float in the air, a trail of blood shooting out from his face as the ceiling raced downwards towards his feet before everything went black. "Town guard! Make way! Make way!" Helmeted men in matching tunics worn over light mail shirts appeared in the doorway. Moving through the crowd, they pushed back with their small rounded shields. Any patron that had the misfortune of blocking their path was pushed, kicked, and backhanded out of the way, their teeth loosening and their heads spinning for their troubles. Cielo saw the guards approaching and started hauling on Hitch's arm to try and bring him to his feet. The dwarf let out a short, sharp gasp as he rose. Soon they were hobbling to the exit like the uncoordinated contestants in a three-legged race. Bursting out of the warm and well-lit tavern, they found themselves in a darkened alley with the others right behind them. They stumbled down the alleyway, tripping over the debris they could not see as their eyes were still adjusting. Coming out onto a main street, they took off running, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the prison cells waiting for them if the town guard caught up. Crossing the street, they headed down another alleyway before turning back in the direction they had come up another main street. They quickly found themselves totally lost, and were sure if the town guard had still been trying to pursue them, they would have been too. Gasping for air and ready to collapse, they paused for a moment to lean up against the wall of a building, peeking around the corner, praying not to see any movement on the street. A cat sauntered over the road, its tail cocked straight up in the air. Dogs held a conversation in the distance before someone stuck their head out of a window to bellow at them to be quiet. "Look, over there," Hitch breathlessly pants as he pointed to a low brick wall topped by a black wrought iron fence. Their gaze followed the fence along until they spotted a pair of gates loosely chained. "It could be a park of some kind," someone piped up hopefully. "Or a graveyard," another interjected. "Whatever it is, it's off the street and away from those guards," Cielo firmly stated before helping Hitch to his feet and leading the way over. One at a time they squeezed through the gate, wincing as the rusty hinges creaked and squealed in protest like a banshee's sighs until they were all through. They padded along the soft low-cut grass, moving from under the cover of stout trees to dash across the moonlit ground. Moving from shadowed patch to patch as though they were being stalked by an eagle on the wing. Pushing through some bushes, they came across a semicircle of trees surrounding a water fountain. A wide circle of white marble glowed eerily in the silver light of Solinari, its water appearing almost black. A statue of a robed woman stood on a plinth in the middle of the water, rising up above its surface. The figure of the woman had turned their head upwards to the sky, almost as though they were basking in the glow of the moon, their arms outstretched at their sides. Stepping closer, Cielo could see down into the water and noticed the bottom of the fountain seemed to sparkle like twinkling stars. "Coins," was the one-word answer Hitch gave to the question before Cielo could voice it. She found herself reflexively reaching out a hand to scoop up all of the treasure in front of her before his hand caught her wrist. "No one threw those coins in there for you. I wouldn't touch anything given an offering to another. The gods are no better than petulant children at times, and while they may ignore the cries of the faithful, surely a terrible punishment awaits any who would take the alms they had been offered." Cielo flinched, taking a step backwards, and she looked up at the statue, expecting its eyes to flare open in shocked outrage at their intrusion. "Forgive me, whoever you are," Cielo quietly whispered before she hesitated for a moment. Unsure of what to do next, she simply bowed quickly at the waist before busying herself with trying to find a place to sleep. They came across a flower garden nearby, neat rows of raised garden beds filled with roses. Their petals shut to the night air, they still gave off the hint of their perfume. The group stretched out on their sides on the soft green grass, placing their backs to the thick wooden slats that made up the raised flower beds. Finally able to allow themselves to relax, their bodies seemed to melt into place, the adrenaline and stress flowing out of them into the soil beneath. Eyelids, heavy as lead ingots, collapsed shut and blissfully dreamless sleep overtook them. Hitch led Cielo away from the others, who had already begun the chorus of snoring and farting to be expected from a group of men full of meat and ale. "Let's stay up for a minute and make sure everything is safe." Hitch sat down on a stone bench carved with climbing vines, sighing in relief as the weight came off his feet. The ale was wearing off now, and he felt where the bruise was sure to be forming over his kidneys. Cielo plopped down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You handled yourself well in there." Cielo couldn't help but notice the pride in his tone. "Better than you, it seems, old man," she teased as she tried to lift the corner of his tunic to inspect his injury. He swatted her hand away with a gentle pat. "I'm far too old for barroom brawls, town watch cells, and hangovers like temple bells." He paused for a moment before continuing. "So I couldn't help but notice you called me Dad before in there." Cielo blushed at the memory. "You may only be a human," he joked, "but I am proud to be your father." She threw her arms around him, squeezing him tight until his battered ribs throbbed in protest. He pried himself loose from her iron-like grip for a moment to tilt her head up to his, wiping the tears from her face as his own streamed down his cheeks into his beard. "I love you, Dad. I love you, daughter, with all my heart." They wrapped their arms around each other and stayed like that as Solinari sang into the sky and Lunatari came into ascendance. Tomorrow we will look for a ship to take us away from this place, Hitch whispered in Cielo's ear. The lads need to look upon their loved ones again. Cielo nodded in agreement. And we need to get some sleep, young lady. The sun will be up before you know it. Hitch eased himself down onto the grass, stretching out on his side. Cielo lay down facing him, her head snuggled into his chest. Wrapping his arms around her, they drifted off to sleep, never feeling so safe and content in all of their lives as the Lady of the Garden stood watch. The Lady of the Garden had been a priestess in another age, a person of great piety and patience. Theirs had been an easy life. Born into a wealthy Salamnic household, they had been lavished with the finest clothes and taught by the wisest of tutors. Blessed with delicate, desirable features, they had gone from being a beautiful child to a stunning young woman who became the object of many a man's matrimonial overtures and outright carnal desires. Whether or not they noticed the attentions being paid to them, which made them the envy of every young woman, it was to matters of religious instruction they applied themselves with great passion and solemn dedication. It is easy to have faith when the winds of good fortune have filled your sails, easy to preach with self-righteous conviction when the blessings of your birth are mistaken for a worshipper's windfall. Long hours were spent in quiet contemplation in the family chapel, studying religious texts, nodding with solemn seriousness before pausing to make notes for their next sermon. At first her congregation was her father's dinner guests, who would politely nod along. Servants were press-ganging into gatherings in kitchens and quarters. As her confidence grew, she left the grounds of her father's estate to walk among the commoners. Her father had hoped the experience would be enough of a shock to her senses that she would either cloister herself in a convent for the rest of her days or turn her attentions to the scions of other noble knightly houses he would wish to align himself with. The girl showed more grit and grace than others would have given her credit for. It was no easy thing to go from perfumed pillows to horse-dung dwellings. She held her head high and forced her nose not to crinkle at the smells that assaulted her. Her expression remained serene and divine as she waved her hands in the ritual gestures of blessing. She was invited into their homes. The sick and the dying presented to her in the hopes that she might heal them. Dutifully she knelt by their bedsides, clasping her hands as she repeated the words that had long been written down. Those that recovered were hailed as proof of her divine providence. Inevitably, when others passed away, it was simply the will of the gods, their time having come. The dead did not rest in peace, though, as others whispered that their passing was a sign that they had not truly been one of the faithful to begin with. Her fame and her ministry grew until a plague had risen that cut through the commoners as wheat before the scythe. The food was hoarded, the gates barred, as the peasants were turned away out of fear they might spread. The epidemic amongst those of noble rank and birth. The lady chose to remain among her people. She could no more hold back the plague with her prayer than a child might turn the tide of an ocean with their hands. Soon even she began to sicken. Her faith did not fail her, even as her skin erupted in painful blackened boils, her lungs filling with fluid, making it hard for her to breathe. Those born into beauty can never truly appreciate the gifts they have been granted until they are taken away, as time and disease will erode the face of mountains and maidens alike. Late one night, when she could no longer stand the pain that racked her body, she travelled away from the village to the peace of a nearby grove, where she hoped none would hear her words. Standing under the full moon of Solanari, their once pure white robes shone brightly in the silver moonlight. Holding their arms out wide, they tilted their head to face the heavenly body above them. Tears flowed down their cheeks as they beseeched their gods to restore their body, as they could stand no longer, go on living as they were. Faces would light up whenever she entered a room, people pleased just to be in her presence. Now they turned away, unable to hide their disgust at her now contorted features. Had she not been their most righteous of servants? Had she not restored the faith of the people and given her followers onto their worship. Her prayers were heard, and for the first time they were truly answered, but would come only at a terrible cost. A great sense of calm washed over her as their wounds began to heal. Their muscles no longer ached, their joints moved with ease. Their skin smoothed out until not even the faintest of blemish could have been detected. It was then that she noticed she could not take a step, for her feet were frozen in place. A cold sensation travelled up her legs, locking them into position. Her beautiful body, now newly restored, was transforming into unadulterated alabaster, as pure and smooth as she had ever been in life. She did not panic. She did not cry out for mercy. She held herself in place until a statue more perfect than anything ever crafted by the hands of men was all that remained. When the statue was found, it was reverently placed within the chapel she had built to minister to her flock. The following day, each man that had carried the statue awoke to find themselves completely restored. The villagers queued from dawn until dusk to kneel before their lady and place their hands upon her feet. When words had reached her father of the fantastical tale, he would not believe it until he had seen it with his own eyes. Leaving his armed escort posted outside the chapel, he entered alone to find his daughter frozen in repose. He knew, in a way that only a parent can, that what stood before him was once the little girl that had raced through his chambers, heedless of upsetting the sensibilities of lords and ladies present as she giggled with glee at the top of her lungs. Falling to his knees, he wept the hot, bitter tears for the loss that tore at his heart and stole the breath from his lungs in wailing sobs. She remained in that chapel at her father's wishes, so that she might continue to serve the people she had given her life to protect. Her powers of healing fading with the faith of the people down through the years, until she was thought of as nothing more than an amazing example of an unknown artisan's craft. The chapel now no longer stands, having been burnt to the ground by a raiding party that carried the statue away as mere plunder to be sold and resold until it found its way into the hands of a collector who instructed it to be installed in their private garden, a perfect addition to the wishing well already in place. So it was that in death she was granted the ability she had sought in life to heal the sick and ease the suffering of those less fortunate than herself. Saint Pio Malidor.